What if I told you that one of history's most beloved saints carried a secret so profound that it physically marked his body forever? Have you ever heard of the quarantine of Saint Michael the Archangel? It's a deep devotion, little known, but one that touched the heart of one of the Church's greatest saints, Saint Francis of Assisi. For 40 days of prayer and penance, he retreated to the mountain in silence and emerged from there bearing the wounds of Christ. But why Saint Michael? Because he is the prince of the heavenly armies, the first to rise against Satan, crying out, "Who is like God?" Which in Hebrew is said Michael. Saint Michael is the defender of the faith, the protector of the church, the guardian of souls at the hour of death. He doesn't fight with human swords, but with the power of God. To make a quarantine with Saint Michael is to enter this spiritual combat alongside heaven's greatest warrior. This isn't just another devotional practice. This is the quarantine of Saint Michael, a 40-day journey that transformed a humble friar into a living testimony of divine love. Today, we're revealing this hidden spiritual weapon that changed the course of Christian mysticism and can revolutionize your own faith journey. Chapter 1. The Origin with Saint Francis. Picture. We're in the year 1224, and while most of medieval Europe was occupied with earthly matters, a poor friar from Assisi was preparing for the most extraordinary spiritual battle of his life. Francis wasn't content with ordinary prayer. He yearned for something deeper, something that would remove every earthly attachment and unite him completely with the divine will. From August 15th to September 29th, Francis would retreat to Mount Laverna, a rocky peak in the Tuscan Apennines. But this wasn't a vacation or even a typical religious retreat. It was spiritual boot camp. Francis chose these specific dates with profound intention, beginning with the Assumption of Our Lady and culminating with the feast of Saint Michael and all angels. He understood that Mary's assumption into heaven opened the portal for intense spiritual warfare, while Michael's feast represented the definitive victory of good over evil. What makes this even more remarkable is that Francis didn't invent this practice on a whim. He was following a pattern as old as Scripture itself. The sacred number 40, Moses on Mount Sinai, Elijah in the desert, Jesus in the desert. Francis recognized that transformation requires time, sacrifice, and most importantly, the protection of heaven's greatest warrior. If you've ever felt called to deeper prayer but didn't know where to start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we're about to reveal exactly how this ancient practice can transform your modern life. But here's what most people don't realize about Francis's retreat. He wasn't alone on that mountain. Local villagers reported seeing unusual lights and hearing angelic music echoing from the peak during those 40 days. Something supernatural was building to a climax that would shock the entire Christian world. Chapter 2. Understanding the Quarantine of Saint Michael. The term quarantine might sound liturgical to our modern ears, but its spiritual roots run much deeper than any period on the church calendar. When Francis embarked on his 40-day journey, he was entering what medieval mystics called a quarantena, a period of spiritual purification that mirrored Christ's own desert experience. This wasn't just extended prayer time, it was voluntary spiritual warfare. During these 40 days, Francis imposed upon himself a regimen that would challenge even the most dedicated monks. Complete fasting except for bread and water, total silence except for prayer, and physical penance that pushed his already frail body to absolute limits. But the real battle wasn't against hunger or discomfort. It was against the spiritual forces that oppose every soul seeking perfect union with God. Francis understood that Saint Michael, as a commander of the heavenly armies, was the perfect companion for such an undertaking. What's fascinating is how Francis structured his retreat around the liturgical calendar. Beginning with Mary's assumption wasn't coincidental. In medieval theology, Mary's bodily assumption into heaven was seen as the definitive victory over death and sin. By starting his quarantine on this feast, Francis was essentially declaring spiritual war against everything that separated him from God. Each day built upon the previous one, creating a crescendo of spiritual intensity that would culminate in ways no one could have predicted. Historical records reveal something even more intriguing. Francis wasn't the only one practicing this devotion. Several of his closest companions, including Brother Leo and Brother Maceo, had adopted their own versions of the 40-day retreat. However, none of them experienced what happened to Francis in 1224, an event so extraordinary that the Church would eventually declare it one of the greatest mystical phenomena in Christian history. Chapter 3. The Biblical Power of 40 Days. Why 40 days? This question haunted medieval theologians and continues to fascinate spiritual seekers today. The answer is buried in the very DNA of salvation history, where the number 40 appears repeatedly as God's chosen time frame for transformation. It's not just a number, it's a divine algorithm for spiritual metamorphosis. Consider the pattern. Noah endured 40 days of floodwaters that washed away the old world and gave birth to a new one. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments, emerging with a face so radiant that the Israelites couldn't look upon him. The Israelites wandered 40 years in the desert, abandoning their slave mentality and becoming God's chosen people. Jesus fasted 40 days in the wilderness, preparing for his public ministry and ultimate sacrifice. Each instance represents complete transformation, not just improvement, but total rebirth. Francis understood this pattern with striking clarity. He wasn't seeking minor spiritual adjustments. He was pursuing complete conformity to Christ. Medieval manuscripts reveal that Francis often spoke of the mathematics of holiness, the idea that God operates according to divine patterns that human souls can access through radical surrender. 40 days wasn't arbitrary. It was the precise amount of time required for grace to completely rewire a human soul. But here's the element that sets Francis's practice apart from biblical precedents. He chose to spend his 40 days specifically with Saint Michael. While Moses encountered God directly and Jesus battled Satan himself, Francis invited heaven's greatest warrior to be his companion and protector. This wasn't just imitation of Scripture, it was innovation within tradition. By combining the transformative power of 40 days with Michael's protective presence, Francis created a spiritual practice so potent that its effects would be literally written on his body. Scientists today study what they call neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself through repeated practices. Francis discovered the spiritual equivalent over 800 years ago. 40 days of intensive prayer and penance, protected by angelic power, could literally reshape a soul to mirror Christ himself. Chapter 4. The Stigmata Experience. September 14th, 1224, the 39th day of Francis's retreat. What happened next defies natural explanation and continues to baffle scientists, theologians, and skeptics alike. As Francis knelt in prayer before a crude wooden cross, witnesses reported seeing a 6-winged seraph, one of the highest-ranking angels, descending from heaven. But this wasn't just any seraph. Between its wings was the figure of Christ crucified, and from this apparition came rays of light so intense that they physically pierced Francis's hands, feet, and side. The stigmata weren't just marks. They were living wounds that bled continuously for the remaining 2 years of Francis's life. Brother Elias, who prepared Francis's body for burial, left detailed testimony describing wounds so perfectly formed that they appeared to be nail heads protruding from both sides of his hands and feet. The wound in his side was large enough to fit a man's hand and occasionally discharged blood and water, mirroring exactly the wound that a Roman soldier inflicted on Christ. What makes this even more extraordinary is Francis's reaction. Most people would have immediately proclaimed such a miracle to the world. Francis did the opposite. He spent his remaining years desperately trying to hide the wounds. He wore gloves constantly, walked with deliberate care to conceal his limp, and made his closest companions swear secrecy. Only Brother Leo was permitted to change the bandages, and even he was forbidden from discussing what he witnessed. Modern medical examinations of historical accounts revealed details that 14th century forgers couldn't have known. The wounds showed characteristics of both entrance and exit injuries. They never became infected despite medieval hygiene standards, and they maintained their fresh appearance until the moment of Francis's death. For the complete stories and prayers of saints who experienced similar divine interventions, including detailed accounts of miraculous healings and mystical experiences, check out our ebook, 50 Saints, Stories and Prayers for Divine Intervention, available in our store below. These authentic testimonies offer both inspiration and practical guidance for deepening your own spiritual journey. But perhaps the most stunning aspect of the stigmata wasn't their appearance. It was their timing. They manifested on the final day of Francis's 40-day retreat with Saint Michael, almost as if the Archangel himself was placing his seal of approval on this radical spiritual practice. Chapter 5. Living the Quarantine Today. You might be thinking, this sounds incredible, but I'm not a medieval monk. How could this possibly apply to my 21st century life? The answer doesn't lie in replicating Francis's extreme physical penances, but in understanding the underlying spiritual principles that made his practice so transformative. The Quarantine of Saint Michael isn't about becoming a historical reenactor. It's about accessing the same divine power that shaped Francis into one of history's greatest saints. Modern practitioners of this devotion have adapted Francis's insights for contemporary life while maintaining the essential elements that make it effective. The 40-day time frame remains crucial. It's long enough for real transformation, but short enough to be achievable. The specific dates from August 15th to September 29th still carry liturgical significance, connecting participants to centuries of spiritual tradition. And the focus on Saint Michael provides the same spiritual protection that Francis relied upon during his intense periods of prayer and sacrifice. Today's version might look like this. Choose a specific sacrifice that challenges but doesn't endanger your health or responsibilities. This could be fasting from social media, giving up a favorite food, or committing to additional prayer time despite a busy schedule. The key is consistency. Whatever you choose must be sustainable for 40 days while still requiring genuine effort. Couple this sacrifice with daily recitation of the Litany of Saint Michael, increased participation in the sacraments, and a conscious effort to engage in spiritual rather than merely material pursuits. What's remarkable is how many contemporary practitioners report experiences that echo Francis's transformation. Not stigmata, obviously, but profound shifts in perspective, increased peace during difficulties, and a deeper sense of divine protection during spiritual struggles. The practice seems to create what spiritual directors call breakthrough moments. Instances where long-standing spiritual obstacles suddenly dissolve and prayer becomes effortless rather than forced. The beauty of this devotion lies in its scalability. A busy parent might choose to wake up 15 minutes earlier for prayer and give up their morning coffee. A college student might fast from entertainment and dedicate that time to spiritual reading. A retiree might embrace more rigorous fasting and extended prayer periods. The form adapts, but the underlying transformation remains constant. Conclusion. Your invitation to transformation. 800 years have passed since Francis emerged from Mount Laverna bearing the wounds of Christ. Yet the quarantine of Saint Michael remains one of Christianity's best-kept secrets. In an age of instant gratification and spiritual shortcuts, this ancient practice offers something radically different. Genuine, lasting transformation through sustained surrender to divine grace. But it demands something our culture rarely asks for: 40 days of consistent, sacrificial commitment. Consider this your personal invitation to join the ranks of those brave enough to attempt what Francis accomplished. Not the stigmata, that was Francis's unique calling, but the deeper transformation that made the stigmata possible. A soul so completely aligned with God's will that it becomes a perfect mirror of divine love. This isn't about becoming a medieval mystic, it's about becoming the saint God designed you to be in your specific time and circumstances. Are you ready to discover what 40 days with heaven's greatest warrior could do in your life? Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell because next week we'll be sharing the exact prayers and practices that modern saints use to walk this ancient path. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear about the transformative power of authentic spiritual warfare. The question isn't whether you're holy enough to attempt this practice. Francis himself was a former party-loving merchant's son who seemed unlikely to become a saint. The question is whether you're hungry enough for real change to commit 40 days to finding out what God can do with a soul that refuses to settle for spiritual mediocrity. Saint Michael is waiting. The 40 days are there for the taking. All that remains is your decision to begin.